The rain came down in sheets, hammering the pavement like it was trying to drown the city. Ethan stood under the awning of a corner store, his breath fogging in the chilly San Francisco air, watching the world blur through the storm. He hadn't expected to see Julian tonight. Not like this, not after everything. But fate had a way of twisting plans. Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket, the screen lighting up with Julian's name. "I'm outside your place. I'm a mess. Can you let me in?" The words hit like a punch, raw and urgent, pulling Ethan back to the apartment he shared with two roommates in the Mission District. He didn't ask questions. He never did with Julian. He just ran, his sneakers splashing through puddles, his heart pounding louder than the rain. When he reached the building, Julian was there, slumped against the doorframe, soaked to the bone. His blonde hair clung to his forehead, and his paint-splattered jeans were streaked with mud. He looked like he'd been through hell, but his eyes, those piercing green eyes, held a fire that hadn't dimmed. "Ethan," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know where else to go." Ethan fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking, not from the cold, but from the weight of seeing Julian like this. They'd been best friends since high school, two misfits navigating a world that didn't always understand them. Ethan, the quiet one with a knack for fixing things, and Julian, the artist with a laugh that could light up a room. But tonight, something was different. The air between them crackled, heavy with unspoken truths. Inside, the apartment was quiet, the roommates out for the night. Ethan led Julian to the bathroom, grabbing a towel from the linen closet. "You're gonna catch pneumonia," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Julian just nodded, his movements sluggish, like he was carrying more than just the weight of wet clothes. Ethan turned on the shower, the steam rising in soft curls, and handed Julian the towel. "Get cleaned up. I'll find you something dry." But Julian didn't move. He stood there, water dripping onto the tiles, his gaze locked on Ethan. "Can you stay?" he asked, his voice breaking. "I don't want to be alone right now." Ethan's breath caught. He'd seen Julian vulnerable before, after breakups, after fights with his parents. But this was different. This was raw, like Julian was peeling back layers he'd kept hidden for years. Ethan nodded, stepping into the small bathroom and closing the door behind him. The space felt too small, the air too thick. Julian started to peel off his shirt, wincing as the fabric clung to his skin. Ethan's eyes traced the lines of his friend's body, the familiar tattoos, the lean muscles, the way his shoulders tensed under some invisible burden. He wanted to ask what happened, why Julian looked like he'd been running from something, but the words stuck in his throat. "Help me," Julian said softly, his hands fumbling with the button of his jeans. Ethan hesitated, his pulse racing. This wasn't the first time he'd seen Julian like this. Years of sleepovers and shared secrets had stripped away most boundaries. But tonight, every touch felt different. Dangerous. The shower hissed behind them, steam clouding the mirror. Julian stepped under the spray, and Ethan stayed close, holding the towel like a lifeline. He tried to focus on the practical, helping his friend, keeping him safe, but his eyes kept drifting to the water running down Julian's back, to the way his head tilted under the stream, like he was trying to wash away more than just the rain. "You don't have to tell me what happened," Ethan said, his voice low, "but I'm here. You know that, right?" Julian turned, his eyes meeting Ethan's through the steam. There was something in his gaze, gratitude, fear, and something deeper, something that made Ethan's chest ache. "I know," Julian whispered. "You're always here." They stood like that for a moment, the sound of the water filling the silence. Ethan wanted to reach out, to pull Julian close, but he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he grabbed the shampoo, squeezing some into his hand. "Turn around," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Julian obeyed, and Ethan worked the shampoo into his hair, his fingers moving gently, carefully, like he was handling something fragile. Julian leaned into the touch, his shoulders relaxing for the first time since he'd shown up. "You're too good to me," he murmured, and Ethan laughed, a shaky sound. "Someone's got to keep you out of trouble." but the words felt hollow. Trouble was Julian's shadow, always following, always pulling him into chaos. And Ethan? He was the one who picked up the pieces every time. As he rinsed the shampoo from Julian's hair, Ethan's hands lingered, tracing the curve of his neck, the line of his jaw. He told himself it was just to make sure the soap was gone, but his heart knew better. Julian turned again, facing him, water streaming down his face. "Ethan," he said, and there was a weight to his name, like it held every secret they'd never spoken. Then, without warning, Julian's hand reached out, his fingers grazing Ethan's arm. It wasn't a casual touch. It was deliberate, slow, like he'd been waiting years to do it. Ethan froze, his breath hitching. The bathroom felt smaller, the world narrowing to the space between them. Julian's eyes searched his, asking a question Ethan wasn't sure he could answer. "I'm sorry," Julian said, his voice barely audible over the water. "I didn't mean to," but he didn't finish. Instead, he stepped closer, his hand sliding to Ethan's wrist, holding it like an anchor. Ethan's mind screamed at him to pull away, to keep things safe, but his body didn't listen. He stayed, rooted to the spot, as Julian's touch burned through him. The rain outside had stopped, but the storm was just beginning. The bathroom was a haze of steam and unspoken words, the air thick with the scent of shampoo, and something heavier, something Ethan couldn't name but felt in every nerve. Julian's hand lingered on his wrist, his fingers warm and steady, and Ethan's heart hammered so loud he was sure Julian could hear it. He wanted to ask what this was, what it meant, but the look in Julian's eyes, raw, unguarded, kept him silent. Julian pulled back, his hand falling to his side, but the space between them felt charged, like a wire stretched taut. "I shouldn't have done that," Julian said, his voice rough, his eyes darting away. He turned back to the shower, letting the water hit his face, as if he could hide behind it. Ethan stood there, the towel still clutched in his hands, his mind racing. He wanted to say it was okay, that he didn't mind, but the words felt too big, too dangerous. Instead, he stepped out of the bathroom, giving Julian space to finish. He leaned against the wall in the hallway, his breath uneven, trying to make sense of the moment. They'd always been close, too close, maybe, for just friends. Sleepovers that ended with them tangled in the same bed, long talks under the stars. The way Julian's laugh made Ethan's chest ache. But this was new. This was crossing a line they'd both danced around for years. He busied himself in the kitchen, pulling out a pot to make tea, something to ground him. The kettle hissed, mirroring the chaos in his head. Julian emerged a few minutes later, wearing Ethan's old sweatshirt and a pair of borrowed sweatpants, his hair damp and curling at the ends. He looked softer, less like the storm that had blown in, but his eyes still carried that weight. "Thanks," Julian said, sitting at the small table, his hands wrapping around the mug Ethan slid toward him. "For everything." Ethan nodded, sitting across from him, the silence stretching. He wanted to ask about the mud, the rain, why Julian had shown up like a ghost, but he started small. "You want to talk about it?" Julian's fingers tightened around the mug, his knuckles whitening. "It's stupid," he said, his voice low. "I got into it with my dad again. He found out about me, about who I am." Ethan's stomach twisted. He knew Julian's dad, strict, old school, the kind of man who saw the world in black and white. Julian had come out to him last year, and it hadn't gone well. But this sounded worse. "He kicked me out," Julian continued, staring into his tea like it held answers. "Said he didn't want a son like me. I didn't know where to go, so I just walked. Ended up here." Ethan's chest ached, a mix of anger at Julian's dad and something softer, something that made him want to reach across the table and hold Julian until the hurt went away. "You can stay here," Ethan said, the words out before he could stop them. "As long as you need." Julian looked up, his eyes searching Ethan's face, like he was trying to find a catch. "You sure? Your roommates. They'll deal." Ethan cut in, his voice firm. "You're not going anywhere." Julian's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. You're too good, Ethan. Always have been. The words hit harder than they should have, stirring something deep in Ethan's chest. He wanted to say he wasn't good, just selfish, because keeping Julian close was as much for him as it was for Julian. They sat there, the tea cooling, the silence softer now. Ethan's mind kept replaying that touch in the bathroom, the way Julian's fingers had lingered, deliberate and heavy with meaning. He wanted to ask about it, to know if it was a mistake or something more, but fear kept him quiet. Instead, he stood, grabbing a blanket from the couch. You take my bed tonight. I'll crash out here. Julian shook his head. No way. I'm not kicking you out of your own bed. His voice was stubborn, but there was a plea in his eyes, like he didn't want to be alone. Ethan sighed, knowing he'd lose this argument. Fine. We'll share. Like old times. Julian's smile was small but real, and it made Ethan's heart skip. They moved to Ethan's room, the space cramped but familiar. The bed was barely big enough for two, but they'd made it work before, back when sleepovers were just sleepovers. Now, though, every brush of their shoulders, every shared glance, felt like a spark. Ethan lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, hyper-aware of Julian's warmth beside him. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of a streetlight through the window. Ethan. Julian's voice was soft, almost hesitant. Yeah. Ethan turned his head, finding Julian's eyes in the dim light. I meant it, Julian said. What I did in the bathroom. I didn't plan it, but I meant it. Ethan's breath caught, his mind spiraling. He wanted to ask what that meant, what Julian was saying, but his voice failed him. Instead, he reached out, his hand finding Julian's under the blanket, their fingers brushing. Julian didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand, lacing their fingers together, the touch grounding and electric all at once. Ethan's heart raced, but he didn't move, didn't speak. He just held on, letting the moment stretch, knowing that whatever this was, it was changing everything. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting stripes across the bed where Ethan and Julian lay, hands still intertwined. Ethan hadn't slept much, his mind too tangled with questions, with the weight of Julian's touch. He could feel Julian's steady breathing beside him, a rhythm that felt both familiar and entirely new. Julian stirred, his eyes fluttering open, and for a moment, they just looked at each other. No words, just the quiet intensity of being seen. Ethan wanted to hold on to this, to freeze the moment before the world crept in, but Julian's phone buzzed on the nightstand, shattering the stillness. He reached for it, his face tightening as he read the screen. It's my sister, he said, his voice low. She's worried. Says Dad's been calling her, trying to find me. Ethan sat up, the blanket pooling around his waist. What does he want? Julian's jaw clenched, and he set the phone down without answering. Doesn't matter. I'm not going back. The words were firm, but Ethan heard the tremor beneath them, the hurt Julian was trying to bury. He wanted to push, to ask more, but he knew Julian, knew he'd talk when he was ready. Instead, Ethan stood, stretching to ease the tension in his shoulders. Come on. You need food. I'm making pancakes. Julian's lips quirked, a faint echo of his usual grin. You? Cook. This I gotta see. Ethan rolled his eyes, but the normalcy of the banter felt like a lifeline, pulling them back from the edge of whatever had shifted last night. The kitchen was a mess of flour and batter by the time they sat down to eat, the small table crowded with plates and mismatched mugs. Julian picked at his pancakes, his mind clearly elsewhere. Ethan watched him, noticing the way his fingers tapped restlessly against the table, the way his eyes kept drifting to the window. You okay? Ethan asked, keeping his tone light. Julian sighed, pushing his plate away. I don't know. It's just everything's hitting me at once. Dad. The fight. Showing up here like a drowned rat. He paused, his gaze locking onto Ethan's. And you? What happened last night? I don't know what I'm doing, Ethan. But I know it felt right. Ethan's heart stuttered, the words landing like a spark in dry grass. He wanted to say it felt right for him too, but fear held him back. Fear of ruining what they had. Fear of wanting too much. Instead, he reached across the table, his hand covering Julian's. "We don't have to figure it out right now," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "You're here. That's enough." Julian's eyes softened, and he turned his hand, squeezing Ethan's fingers. "You make it sound so simple," he said, a hint of a smile breaking through. The moment was interrupted by the front door banging open, Ethan's roommates stumbling in with coffee cups and laughter. "Yo, Ethan, you cooking for once?" Maria called, her voice teasing as she dropped her bag on the couch. She stopped short when she saw Julian, her eyes narrowing with concern. "You okay, Jules? You look like you got hit by a truck." Julian laughed, the sound brittle but genuine. "Something like that." Maria didn't push, but her glance at Ethan said she'd want details later. The roommates joined them at the table, the mood lightening with their chatter, but Ethan felt the undercurrent of tension, the unspoken questions hanging between him and Julian. After breakfast, Julian offered to help clean up, and they worked side by side at the sink, shoulders brushing. It was mundane, domestic, but every touch felt like a conversation, a continuation of the night before. Ethan caught Julian watching him, his expression unreadable but heavy with something that made Ethan's pulse race. "Let's get out of here," Julian said suddenly, drying his hands on a dish towel. "I need air." "You in?" Ethan nodded, grabbing his jacket. They stepped out into the San Francisco morning, the city alive with the hum of traffic and the distant clang of streetcars. They walked without a destination, weaving through the Mission's colorful streets, past murals and taco trucks, the air sharp with the scent of coffee and sea salt. As they passed a small park, Julian stopped, his eyes catching on a group of kids playing soccer. "Remember when we used to do that?" he said, his voice soft. "Just kick a ball around. No worries, no complications." Ethan nodded, memories flooding back, sunlit fields, Julian's wild grin, the way they'd collapse in the grass, laughing until they couldn't breathe. "Yeah," Ethan said. "Feels like a lifetime ago." Julian turned to him, his expression serious. "I don't want to lose that, Ethan. I don't want to lose you." The words hit like a wave, and Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him. He wanted to say he wasn't going anywhere, that Julian was stuck with him, but the intensity in Julian's eyes stopped him. Instead, he stepped closer, their shoulders brushing. "You won't," he said, and it felt like a promise. The park was alive with the sounds of the city, kids shouting, a street musician strumming a guitar, the hum of life that made San Francisco feel like a heartbeat. Ethan and Julian sat on a bench, watching the soccer game, the silence between them comfortable but heavy with unspoken words. Ethan could still feel the ghost of Julian's hand in his, the memory of last night's touch lingering like a bruise. Julian leaned back, his hands behind his head, staring at the sky. "I used to think I could outrun all this," he said, his voice low. "The fights with my dad, the way people look at me when they find out I'm me. But it catches up, doesn't it?" Ethan nodded, his throat tight. He'd seen the way the world could chip away at Julian, the way his confidence hit 1,000 small wounds. "You don't have to run alone," Ethan said. "Not anymore." Julian turned to him, his eyes searching. "You mean that?" Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. He wanted to say more, to spill everything he'd kept locked away. The way Julian's smile made his chest ache, the way he'd spent years pretending his feelings were just friendship. But the words stayed stuck, trapped behind years of habit. They walked on, ending up at a small cafe on Valencia Street, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and art-covered walls. Julian ordered a black coffee, Ethan a latte, and they sat by the window, watching the world go by. The cafe was crowded, filled with the chatter of students and the clink of cups, but it felt like they were in their own bubble, the rest of the world fading away. Julian stirred his coffee, his movements restless. "I've been thinking," he said, not meeting Ethan's eyes. "About us. About what's been happening." Ethan's heart skipped, his fingers tightening around his mug. Yeah, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Julian took a deep breath, like he was steeling himself. I've always known, how I feel about you. But I was scared. Scared of messing this up, of losing you. Ethan's breath caught, the world tilting. He'd suspected, hoped maybe, but hearing it out loud was different. It was real. Julian, he started, but Julian held up a hand, his expression pleading. Let me finish. Please. I've been carrying this for years, and I need to say it. Ethan nodded, his heart in his throat. I love you, Julian said, the words rushing out like they'd been trapped too long. Not just as a friend. I mean, yeah, you're my best friend, but it's more than that. It's always been more. He laughed, a shaky sound. God, I sound like an idiot. But last night, when I touched you, I couldn't hold it back anymore. Ethan stared at him, his mind reeling. He'd spent so long burying his own feelings, convincing himself they were one-sided, that hearing this felt like a dream. Julian, he said, his voice rough, I love you too. The words felt like a release, like letting go of a weight he'd carried for years. Julian's eyes widened, a mix of relief and disbelief, and then he laughed, a real laugh, bright and unguarded. God, we're a mess, Julian said, leaning back in his chair, his smile wide. Ethan laughed too, the tension breaking like a dam. They sat there, grinning like idiots, the cafe buzzing around them. For the first time, Ethan felt like he could breathe, like the world made sense. But the moment didn't last. Julian's phone buzzed again, and his smile faded as he glanced at the screen. It's my dad, he said, his voice flat. He's at my sister's place. Says he wants to talk. Ethan's stomach twisted, the warmth of the moment replaced by a cold dread. You don't have to go, he said, but Julian shook his head. I need to, he said, his jaw tight. I can't keep running. But will you come with me? Ethan didn't hesitate. Of course. They paid for their coffees and stepped back into the city, the weight of Julian's words still hanging between them, a promise and a challenge all at once. The drive to Julian's sister's apartment in No Valley was quiet, the radio filling the silence with soft indie rock. Ethan kept stealing glances at Julian, who stared out the window, his hands clenched in his lap. When they pulled up to the small Victorian building, Julian's sister, Lila, was waiting outside, her arms crossed, her expression worried. He's inside, Lila said, hugging Julian tightly. He's calmer, I think. But be careful, okay? Julian nodded, his face set, and Ethan followed him inside, his heart pounding. The apartment was small, cluttered with books and plants, a stark contrast to the tension filling the air. Julian's dad sat on the couch, his face lined with exhaustion. He looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing at Ethan before settling on Julian. You ran off, he said, his voice gruff. Didn't even give me a chance to talk. Julian crossed his arms, his stance defensive. You made it pretty clear you didn't want me around. Ethan stood close, his presence a silent support, as the room crackled with years of unspoken hurt. The living room felt like a battlefield, every word a potential landmine. Julian's dad, Robert, leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes fixed on his son. Ethan stood just behind Julian, close enough to feel the tension radiating off him, ready to step in if things went south. Lila hovered near the doorway, her arms still crossed, watching the scene like a hawk. I didn't mean for it to go like that, Robert said, his voice rough but softer than Ethan expected. I was angry, Julian. I didn't know how to handle it. Julian's laugh was sharp, cutting. Handle it? You told me I was a disgrace. You threw me out. Robert flinched, and for a moment, Ethan saw something like regret in his eyes, but it was fleeting. I was wrong, Robert said, the words heavy, like they cost him something. I'm not saying I understand all this. He gestured vaguely, his discomfort clear. But you're my son. I don't want to lose you. Julian's shoulders stiffened, and Ethan could see the war in his eyes, years of hurt battling with the faint hope of reconciliation. You don't get it, Julian said, his voice low, trembling with barely contained emotion. This isn't something you can just tolerate. It's who I am. He glanced at Ethan, and the look was so raw, so full of trust, that Ethan's heart ached. And I'm not hiding anymore. Not for you. Not for anyone. Robert's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Ethan could see the effort it took, the way his hands clenched and unclenched. I'm trying, Julian, he said finally. I don't know how to do this, but I'm trying. The room fell silent, the weight of those words settling over them. Ethan wanted to reach for Julian, to anchor him, but he stayed still, letting Julian navigate this moment. Lila stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. Dad, you need to listen to him. Really listen. Robert nodded, his eyes dropping to the floor. I know, he said quietly. I need time. Julian's expression softened, just a fraction, but he didn't speak. Ethan could see the exhaustion in him, the toll of carrying this fight for so long. They left the apartment not long after, the conversation ending without resolution but with a fragile thread of hope. Outside, the air was cool, the sky streaked with the pinks and purples of dusk. Julian leaned against the car, his head tilted back, eyes closed. That was something, he said, his voice tired but lighter. Ethan stood beside him, their shoulders brushing. You did good, he said. You said what you needed to. Julian opened his eyes, looking at Ethan with a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something that made Ethan's pulse quicken. I couldn't have done it without you, he said. You being there, it made me braver. Ethan's throat tightened, and he reached out, his hand finding Julian's. Always, he said, the word of vow. They drove back to the mission, the city lights blurring past, a quiet understanding settling between them. Back at the apartment, Ethan's roommates were out again, leaving the space theirs. Julian dropped onto the couch, pulling Ethan down beside him. They sat close, the silence comfortable, the weight of the day easing with every shared breath. I meant what I said at the cafe, Julian said suddenly, his voice soft but sure. I love you, Ethan, and I'm done being scared of it. Ethan's heart stuttered, the words sinking in, warm and overwhelming. He turned, meeting Julian's gaze, seeing the truth of it there. I'm done being scared too, he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. Julian leaned in, slow and deliberate, his lips brushing Ethan's in a kiss that was soft but searing, full of years of unspoken longing. Ethan kissed him back, his hands finding Julian's face, pulling him closer. It was like coming home, like finding a piece of himself he hadn't known was missing. The world fell away, leaving just them, tangled together on the couch, hearts racing in sync. When they pulled back, breathless, Julian rested his forehead against Ethan's, a smile playing on his lips. We're really doing this, huh? He said, half laughing, half awed. Ethan grinned, his thumb brushing Julian's cheek. Yeah, we are. They stayed like that, wrapped in each other, the city humming outside, the future uncertain but theirs to face together. But the peace was short-lived. Julian's phone buzzed again, and this time, it was a text from Lila. Dad's coming to the city tomorrow. Wants to meet again. You okay with that? Julian's smile faded, and Ethan felt the tension creep back in. What do you want to do? Ethan asked, his hand still on Julian's. Julian sighed, his eyes distant. I don't know, but I know I'm not doing it alone. Ethan squeezed his hand, a silent promise. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The next morning dawned gray, the San Francisco fog rolling in thick, wrapping the city in a quiet hush. Ethan woke to find Julian already up, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. The weight of the impending meeting with his dad was etched into the lines of his face, and Ethan felt a surge of protectiveness, a need to shield him from whatever hurt might come. You don't have to do this today, Ethan said, sitting up and resting a hand on Julian's shoulder. Julian leaned into the touch, but his eyes stayed on the window. I know, he said, but if I keep running, I'll never stop. I need to face him. Ethan nodded, understanding the resolve in Julian's voice, even if it scared him. "I'm with you," he said, and Julian's hand found his, squeezing tightly. They met Robert at a small diner near the Embarcadero, the kind of place with greasy coffee and vinyl booths that squeaked. Robert was already there, sitting stiffly at a corner table, his hands wrapped around a mug. He looked older in the morning light, the lines in his face deeper, his eyes weary but determined. Julian slid into the booth across from him, Ethan beside him, their knees touching under the table. "I'm glad you came," Robert said, his voice low, almost hesitant. Julian nodded, his expression guarded. "I'm here. So talk." The bluntness made Robert wince, but he didn't back down. "I was wrong," he said, the words deliberate. "Not just about the other night, but for a long time. I didn't see you, Julian. Not really." Ethan watched Julian's face, saw the flicker of surprise, the cautious hope. "What's changed?" Julian asked, his voice steady but laced with skepticism. Robert sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I talked to your mom, to Lila. They made me see how much I've hurt you. I don't understand everything. Maybe I never will, but I want to try. I want my son back." The words hung in the air, heavy with years of distance. Julian's hand tightened on Ethan's under the table, and Ethan squeezed back, grounding him. "I'm not going to change who I am," Julian said, his voice firm. "Not for you. Not for anyone. I'm gay, Dad. And I'm in love with Ethan." The words were a declaration, bold and unapologetic, and Ethan's heart swelled, even as his pulse raced at being named so openly. Robert's eyes flicked to Ethan, a mix of surprise and something else, resignation, maybe. He nodded slowly. "I hear you," he said. "I'm not asking you to change. I want to be part of your life. If you'll let me." Julian's eyes softened, but he didn't speak right away. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment, the years of pain and misunderstanding hanging between father and son. The conversation shifted, tentative but real, as they talked about small things: Lila's new job, Robert's plans to retire, Julian's latest art project. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, a crack in the wall that had stood between them. Ethan stayed quiet, his presence a steady support, his hand never leaving Julian's. When they left the diner, the fog had lifted, the city sparkling under a rare burst of sunlight. Julian exhaled, like he'd been holding his breath the whole time. "That was better than I expected," he said, his voice soft. Ethan smiled, nudging his shoulder. "You were incredible." Julian laughed, a real laugh, and pulled Ethan into a quick, fierce hug, right there on the sidewalk. They spent the rest of the day wandering the city, letting the tension of the morning fade. They ended up at Ocean Beach, the waves crashing against the shore, the air sharp with salt. Julian kicked off his shoes, running toward the water with a grin, and Ethan followed, laughing as the cold waves hit their ankles. They stood there, side by side, the ocean stretching out before them, vast and endless. "I feel like I can breathe again," Julian said, his voice almost lost in the wind. Ethan looked at him, the sunlight catching in his hair, and felt a rush of love so strong it almost knocked him over. "Good," he said, reaching for Julian's hand. "Because I'm not going anywhere." That night, back at the apartment, they curled up together on Ethan's bed, the city humming outside. Julian traced lazy patterns on Ethan's arm, his touch light but deliberate. "I don't know what comes next," he said, his voice quiet. "But I know I want it with you." Ethan kissed him, slow and deep, pouring everything he felt into it: love, hope, the promise of a future they'd build together. As they fell asleep, tangled in each other, Ethan knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they'd face them as one. The weeks that followed were a blur of new beginnings, each day a step into uncharted territory. Ethan and Julian settled into a rhythm, their relationship shifting from the familiar comfort of friendship to something deeper, more vulnerable. The apartment became their sanctuary, a place where they could be themselves, free from the world's judgments. But the world was still there, waiting, and it wasn't always kind. Julian moved in officially, his art supplies taking over one corner of Ethan's room, his sketches pinned to the walls like a map of his heart. Ethan loved watching him work, the way his hands moved with purpose, turning blank pages into stories. But he also saw the shadows that lingered. Julian's fear that his dad's acceptance was fragile, that the city's vibrant freedom could turn cruel in an instant. One evening, they attended a gallery opening in Soma, where Julian's latest piece, a vivid mural of intertwined hands, bold and unapologetic, was on display. The room buzzed with artists and locals, rainbow flags draped over the bar, the air alive with laughter and music. Julian stood by his work, his smile nervous but proud, and Ethan stayed close, his hand brushing Julian's in quiet support. A stranger approached, a man with sharp eyes and a clipboard, clearly a critic. "This is powerful," he said, gesturing to the mural. "It's raw, honest. You're not afraid to show who you are." Julian's face lit up, and Ethan felt a surge of pride, watching his partner, because that's what Julian was now, shine in his element. But not everyone was kind. Later, as they left the gallery, a group of guys lingered outside, their voices loud, their words cutting. "Faggots," one muttered, just loud enough to hear. Julian tensed, his hand tightening on Ethan's, but he didn't stop walking. Ethan's blood boiled, but he followed Julian's lead, their steps steady, their connection a shield against the hate. Back at the apartment, Julian was quiet, his earlier joy dimmed. Ethan pulled him close, wrapping his arms around him. "They don't matter," he said, his voice fierce. "They don't get to take this from us." Julian nodded, his head resting against Ethan's chest. "I know. It's hard sometimes." Ethan kissed his forehead, wishing he could erase the hurt. "I've got you," he said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. Over time, Julian's relationship with his dad grew, not without effort, but with small victories, a phone call that didn't end in shouting, a dinner where Robert asked about Julian's art without flinching. Ethan watched it unfold, marveling at Julian's strength, his ability to forgive without losing himself. And through it all, their love grew stronger, rooted in the trust they'd built over years, now blooming into something new. One night, as they lay in bed, the city quiet outside, Julian turned to Ethan, his eyes bright in the dark. "I never thought I'd have this," he said. "You, us, a life where I'm not hiding." Ethan smiled, his hand finding Julian's. "You deserve it," he said. "We both do." They fell asleep to the sound of distant waves, the city's heartbeat echoing their own. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Love never was, not in a world that could be so harsh, but they had each other. And that was enough. Their story wasn't just about the night Ethan helped Julian shower, or the touch that changed everything. It was about the courage to love, to stand tall in the face of fear, to build a home in each other's hearts. It was about two people finding their way, not just to each other, but to themselves, in a world that didn't always understand. And as they faced the future, hand in hand, they knew that whatever came, they'd face it together, their love a light that no storm could dim.